Dear fellow unbelievers, nothing would have kept me from joining you, except the loss of my voice, at least my speaking voice, which in turn is due to a long argument I am currently having with the specter of death. Nobody ever wins this argument, though there are some solid points to be made while the discussion goes on. I have found, as the enemy becomes more familiar, that all the special pleading for salvation, redemption, and supernatural deliverance appears even more hollow and artificial to me than it did before. I hope to help defend and pass on the lessons of this for many years to come. But for now I have found my trust better placed in two things: the skill and principle of advanced medical science, and the comradeship of innumerable friends and family, all of them immune to the false consolations of religion. It is these forces, among others, which will speed the day when humanity emancipates itself from the mind-forged manacles of servility and superstition. It is our innate solidarity, and not some despotism of the sky, which is the source of our morality and our sense of decency. That essential sense of decency is outraged every day. Our theocratic enemy is in plain view, protean in form. It extends from the overt menace of nuclear-armed mullahs to the insidious campaigns to have stultifying pseudoscience taught in American schools. But in the past few years, there have been heartening signs of a genuine and spontaneous resistance to this sinister nonsense, a resistance which repudiates the rights of bullies and tyrants to make the absurd claim that they have God on their side. To have had a small part in this resistance has been the greatest honor of my lifetime. The pattern and original of all dictatorship is the surrender of reason to absolutism and the abandonment of critical, objective inquiry. The cheap name for this lethal delusion is religion, and we must learn new ways of combating it in the public sphere, just as we have learned to free ourselves of it in private. Our weapons are the ironic mind against the literal, the open mind against the credulous, the courageous pursuit of truth against the fearful and abject forces who would set limits to investigation, and who stupidly claim that we already have all the truth we need. Perhaps above all, we affirm life over the cults of death and human sacrifice, and are afraid not of inevitable death, but rather of a human life that is cramped and distorted by the pathetic need to offer mindless adulation, or the dismal belief that the laws of nature respond to wailings and incantations. As the heirs of a secular revolution, American atheists have a special responsibility to defend and uphold the Constitution that patrols the boundary between church and state. This, too, is an honor and a privilege. Believe me when I say that I am present with you, if not corporeally, and only metaphorically in spirit, resolved to build up Mr. Jefferson's wall of separation, and don't keep the faith. Sincerely, Christopher Hitchens.
And I can't find a seconder usually when I propose this, but I don't care. I don't need a seconder. My own opinion is enough for me, and I claim the right to have it defended against any consensus, any majority, anywhere, any place, any time. And anyone who disagrees with this can pick a number, get online, and kiss my ass.
Actually, in the present situation, the main threat to free expression comes from public opinion. So for a Democrat, someone who believes in popular sovereignty, it's a very great problem that public pressure, the pressure of the masses, if you like, is the one that you most likely have to face. And it's also much the hardest to resist, because you'll be accused of being an elitist. You can even be accused of being a racist if you simply say, no, I'm sorry, I reserve the right to criticize anything I like, and in particular, if you reserve the right, insist upon the right to criticize faith or religion. At that point, you may find yourself in some difficulty, and your editor will not tell you, I've been under pressure from the FBI to shut you up. He'll tell you, I've been under pressure from the community to do it.
But does that amendment
And to me, part of growing up is to say the community can go to hell, as far as that's concerned. I don't care about the community. I don't care about the crowd. I don't care about public opinion.
Well, let me go back to your words, and then we'll open it up to calls. You conclude your book by saying, and this may summarize the essence of the book, the high ambition, therefore, seems to me to be this, that one should strive to combine the maximum of impatience with the maximum of skepticism, the maximum of hatred, of injustice and irrationality with the maximum of ironic self-criticism. This would mean really deciding to learn from history rather than invoking it.
It's not bad. It's quite well put.
So what's the message?
Well, the message is to try and live your life as if you were a free person, that you didn't have to wonder what anyone else's opinion was, that you should take the risk of believing that if you're the only person who thinks what you think, that still might well mean that you were right. In fact, though that loneliness often makes people wonder, because perhaps out of modesty they feel, well, if I feel this way and everyone else doesn't, maybe I'm crazy, or maybe there's something they know that I don't. I'm trying to encourage people not to think like that. You'll notice sometimes on chat shows, I'm sure, and call-in shows as well, people will often say, well, as so-and-so was just saying, and as I quite agree, and they're nervous. They don't want to speak in their own voice. They won't ever quite come out and say, this is what I think. What I'm trying to give people the confidence to do, in other words, is to not only think that even if you're the only one who thinks it could be true, but to imagine that actually, if the majority thinks one thing, it's more likely than not to be wrong. Indeed, as John Stuart Mill said, if all in society were agreed on the truth and beauty and value of one proposition, all except one person, it would be most important, in fact it would become even more important, that one heretic be heard, because we would still benefit from his perhaps outrageous or appalling view. That person doesn't just have a right to speak. That person's right to speak must be given extra protection, because what he has to say must have taken him some effort to come up with, might contain a grain of historical truth, might in any case give people to think about why do they know what they already think they know. How do I know that I know this, except that I've always been taught this and never heard anything else?
People have already asked me and written to me, students or readers, younger people, well, how do you make a living being in opposition, which is what I seem to do.
Yeah.
And is it a positive thing that you think you're doing, or is it just negative? Is it just being on the contrary?
Right.
Or does it have a positive? So I said, okay, I have half written this. So it was a great pleasure to do it properly, or, well, what I think is properly. And to say, well, it's not for everybody. Not everyone wants to always be an awkward cuss, or out of step, or against the stream. But if you do feel that the consensus doesn't speak for you, if there's something about you that makes you feel that it would be worth being unpopular or marginal, for the chance to lead your own life and have a life instead of a career or a job, then I can promise you it is worthwhile, yeah.
Thank you for the slight health warning, and thank you, those of you who took him up on it. We'll be bringing it on.
Okay. Let's begin with what I suspect is the most recent thing that most of us have encountered of yours, with the Kissinger film. Okay. I guess we better hold these up to our mouths. Is this okay? All right. Let's begin with what I suspect is the most recent thing of yours that most of us have encountered, which is the Kissinger film and the book that gave rise to it. What you were really doing in the film and the book is telling us that Henry Kissinger ought to be indicted as a war criminal. Give us a bill of particulars of the indictment.
Well, war criminal is Henry Kissinger's job description, and has been since he first caught Richard Nixon's eye as a talented guy in 1968. And since then he's had a sort of one-man international rolling crime wave, extending not just through the subversion of the United States election of that year and the betrayal and subversion of the Paris peace talks, both of them, in my opinion, acts of treason, but through the devastation of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the prolonging of an unjust war of aggression and atrocity for at least 4 years. In those 4 years, you will remember, comrades, about half the names on the Vietnam Memorial were inscribed, and we wouldn't have the nerve or the ability to put up a wall that would have all the names of the Indo-Chinese on it. Then to Chile, to the destruction of parliamentary democracy and the murder of its president. Then to Cyprus, a similar coup against an elected president, the destruction of a democracy, the partition of Cyprus between two aggressive NATO powers. Then the direct individual collusion, sitting in the room with the planners of the invasion and extirpation of East Timor. And I don't think I have exhausted. No, I've left out Angola, for example. I've left out Bangladesh. I've done this a lot of times. I always leave out something. I sometimes look at my own stuff and think, is this all true? I went over it with the fact checkers and felt sick at thinking, really, we're not, all of this is it all did happen. It all really did occur. Now, since the book came out and since the film was made, I can report some, at least, mildly encouraging developments. On Memorial Day last year, I'm proud to say, just after my book came out in French, Mr. Kissinger was visited in the Ritz Hotel in Paris by the gendarmerie and served with a summons to testify about what he knew about the disappearance of French people in Chile. He fled town. He fled town on the same day and hasn't gone back, and the summons is still current if he does go. Since then, the magistrates in Argentina, Judge Rodolfo Corral, who's the main prosecutor in the death squad cases in Argentina, have summoned him as well. So has Judge Guzman from Chile, the justice in the Pinochet case. I went down to Chile a few months ago and testified before Judge Guzman myself against Kissinger. A case is being built. The Brazilian government recently told Kissinger to cancel a trip, an official trip he was making. An attempt was made to arrest him on his last visit to London. It's not much, but the air around the bastard is being shrunk a bit. The oxygen's being taken away. And he can't travel much, and when he does, he has to consult lawyers. And there is in federal court in Washington, D.C., filed, alas, on September the 11th, 2001, which, as you also know, is the anniversary of the coup in Chile, but for that reason not as well known as it might be. The relatives of General Schneider, the murdered head of the Chilean General Staff in 1970, have filed a federal suit against Henry Kissinger for murder. And every document in that suit is a US government declassified document. That's, as far as I know, an unprecedented lawsuit. And this is good news, too. So at least I think I can say I've probably changed his obituary. I used to wish he would die. Now I hope he will live until justice catches up with him. But let me just remark something to you. Chilean courts, Argentine courts, French courts, Chilean civilians bringing their own lawsuit, paying for it themselves, who've already had family members murdered. What's missing here? What's missing here is a sense of shame on the part of everyone in the United States. Why is an American district attorney not doing this? Why is Congress not doing it? Why are the American courts not doing it? And why is the United States government sheltering a wanted war criminal? These are the main questions.
100,000 years since we dared to became separate from the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals as our own species, Homo sapiens. Here's what you have to believe to be a theist. For 100,000 years, humanity is born. Perhaps 25% of it dies in childbirth, or very shortly afterwards. Life expectancy, I don't know, 25 for a very long time. Infant mortality, extraordinary, after childbirth deaths, I mean. Killed by microorganisms we didn't know existed, by earthquakes that we thought were portents, by storms that we didn't know came from our climate system, by other events that arise from being born onto a cooling planet with deep cracks in its crust, faults in its crust. Then man-made things, turf wars, fights over women, fights over territory, over food, and so on. Very, very slow, gradual, exponential upward progress, we might like to think. Pretty slow, but at least we can claim, out of our own self-respect, man-made. And for the first 96,000 years of this experience, heaven watches with folded arms. Us go through this with indifference, without pity. And then around 4,000 years ago decides, gee, it's time to intervene. And the best way of doing that would probably be in Bronze Age Middle East, making appearances to stupefied illiterate peasants, which could later be passed on. The news would get to China after about 1,000 years of that.
2 minutes.
That's what you have to believe.
What Hemingway once said when asked by somebody why his books were so easy to read, he said, "It's easy to read because it was hard to write." I grew up in a standard English middle-class home, as I think was quite common at the time, where there probably wasn't very much discussion of religion. There was quite a lot of religion at school, but I don't recall it ever coming up at home, and I don't think we would, for instance, generally go to church during the school holidays. But on the other hand, we would have religious services every day at school. The formal renunciation, a Bible burning incident, I suppose I must have been 15. It's a moment when you start wanting to be separate from your parents, and therefore you separate yourself, of course, from a lot of the things that your parents stand for, or you think that they stand for, and from, in my case, most of the adults who'd up until then influenced your life. So I had my life taken up with a pretty detailed and demanding secular faith. I didn't have any shortage of things to believe in. And then after that, I tried, as many former Marxists do, to make my peace with a world which I increasingly realized didn't need to be overthrown by revolution.
Well, I was originally a journalist because I was a revolutionary socialist, and I wanted to serve the cause of the revolution by getting into journalism and using my position in newspapers to promote the revolutionary cause. And then I changed my mind.
The moment you then go out into what might be called the normal world, and are dealing every day with, particularly in my case, it would have been police officers, fire brigades, and the kind of people who news reporters are constantly talking about, realizing that they were not like me. They didn't believe what I believed. That they were people who I'd previously, in many ways, despised or seen as figures of useless or pointless authority, and they weren't. And then you began to put together, or rather not to be able to put together anymore, the things which you thought and the things which you experienced. And the terrifying thing about beginning to change your mind is that there is no stopping. It is metaphorically like falling through a floor which suddenly gives way beneath your feet, and falling so fast that when you hit the floor below, that gives way beneath you as well. And huge numbers of things which you'd not questioned and not thought to be open to question suddenly become questionable. This is some hideous symbol of Mother India, somewhere outside Bombay. The people behind me are bathing in the Ganges, guys in downtown Havana. If it weren't for the sunshine and the rum, I think they'd all go mad. Uzbekistan, one of the new dictatorships which has sprung up since the Soviet Union. This is the Islamic University of Deoband. This is Moscow. This is the new rebuilt Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. That's me in the Shwedagon Pagoda. That's some British troops just outside the Green Zone in Baghdad. A defaced Saddam Hussein. The Mandalay Rangoon Express pausing at a small town in the middle of Burma. And they make jokes about the regime. And I won't say they're the most terrific comedians I've ever heard, but they're some of the bravest people I've ever seen.
Being a conservative journalist has many joys. Not least you can write things other people can't write and won't write. You can get closer to the truth because conservatives do. But on the other hand, in Britain particularly, you get a lot of derision and personal mockery and abuse from people who would rather do that than argue with you.
If you don't like arguments and intellectual combat, then don't join. But if you can take it and get any pleasure out of it, it'll help.
After a while, you learn to take pleasure in being derided and sneered at and generally treated as if you were the lowest of the low.
But the real purpose is to try and change the general state of opinion and alter things so that the world can be changed for the better. I think it's important to say that atheism led me to faith, because so many people view atheism as the final station on the railroad. That you arrive there, that you've been through everything else, that the argument is finished, and that you have permanently rejected something which is restricted really to the childhood of mankind. You can actually see from where I sit that far from being the end of the argument, it's the beginning of the argument. The story goes like this. There we were, a good lunch inside us, my then girlfriend, now my wife, and I wandering around the lovely town of Beaune in the middle of Burgundy in France. Looked at the guidebook and it recommended particularly a work of art. Went to look at it thinking, oh, another religious painting. And it was a painting of the Last Judgment by a man called Roger van der Weyden. And to my astonishment, the layers of time and distance which normally lie over old paintings were stripped away, because the people in it were actually people just like me and the people I knew. And the shock of seeing this plunged me into a whole train of thought from which I have yet to escape. That is to say, the realization of something that I'd always been taught and had for many years rejected, that I might myself be judged. I lived in the dying years of the Soviet Union in Moscow. I traveled extensively in the regions run by communism. I saw it, and I know how very, very hostile it was to religion and why it was. And one of the things I want to communicate to people is how that hostility is now being reforged by new atheists who in many cases have no idea of the forces they're trying to summon out of the ground, and very little idea of the dangers of what they're doing. If you drive God out of the world, then you create a howling wilderness. There is, as it were, a Hitchens brand. Brothers are brothers. You got them whether you want to have them or not. My poor father tried to get us to sign a peace treaty. This book has come about because my brother wrote a book attacking God and Christianity and religion in general. There is an argument to be had. There are things that he says that are wrong. If he wants to write about Henry Kissinger, then that's fine by me. I don't know or actually care very much about Henry Kissinger, but he doesn't know any more about God than I do. Thinking what I think and believing what I believe, that I would hope that my brother would change his mind. I make very limited claims for myself. I travel the world. I try and keep up with events. If somebody says, have you read such and such, and I haven't, I'll say, no, I haven't read it. I would think that most educated atheists are much more likely to be suddenly ambushed in the heart by poetry than they ever are likely to be converted by reasoned argument. A lot of what is conveyed by Christianity has to be conveyed in this form because words, even the most beautiful words, can't fully convey it. The arts, which have always had most effect on me, these things are immensely potent. I think that if people are exposed to them, then they may find that the still small voice is audible. Young students sometimes write and say, well, what do I need to do to be a journalist? And I always say, just before you do anything else, read Orwell's essay on politics in the English language as the absolute foundation of how anyone should approach writing plainly about the truth. This country ceased to be truly Christian in terms of people genuinely, consciously, and in an educated way believing in the Christian faith after the First World War. People still continue to behave as if they're Christians. The society continues to function as if it's a Christian society for some time after it's gone. We've been living in the past 40 or 50 years in the afterglow of Christianity, but eventually the darkness falls.
Their email, Jim and Maya in Philadelphia. Hello, Mr. Hitchens. Thank you for many things in this opportunity. Our question is as follows. In spite of our newly found adoration for everything Hitchens, we are sincerely troubled by your public statements which you have dismissing global warming, and we wonder how such a great mind is so obviously missing the boat.
I've never made a statement on global warming that I know about. And I don't think anyone wants to hear from me about it. I mean, I have written about the ozone layer question very early on. I wrote a couple of pieces saying, look, this is very important because it does suggest that damage has been done to the biosphere itself, not just the environment. And this would have very grave implications because we'd all be in the same boat here. All the money in the world won't buy you a place for your kid at a school with better ozone than elsewhere. But I mean, steps were taken about the chlorofluorocarbon question, I think it was. The aerosol business, anyway. And it seems that the hole over the ozone layer is to some extent healed, though there are periods over Antarctica where apparently it widens. You see how much I know about this. The argument about global warming, it seems to me, is not whether there is any warming, but whether or not human activity, or to what extent human activity is responsible for it. My line on that is we should act as if it is. For this reason, which I borrowed from Jonathan Schell's book on the nuclear question, The Fate of the Earth. We don't have another planet on which to run the experiment. We can't find out but one way. And just as we don't have the right to run an experiment in nuclear exchange on this planet, because it doesn't belong to us to that extent, we've no right to run an experiment in warming on it either. And if it turned out to be that there was no severe global warming threat, or that it wasn't man-made, then all we would have done would be make a mistake in analysis, which we could correct for. But if it turned out that there was, and we'd done nothing about it, then it would be too late to do anything at all, and that would lead to disaster. I have been told, though, and I'm afraid to say I think it may be true, that the warming is coming now whatever we do. That by the time we found out about the coming rise in temperature, that it was probably on its way. I've heard a lot of people who strongly take the Al Gore thesis, the Al Gore analysis, say that, alas, we're going to find out what it's going to be like no matter what we do.
Didn't he come after you? He called you a Holocaust denier, and then you forced him to retract it, right?
Well, I tried to get him to sue me because in England, where the libel law favours the plaintiff very much, and in other jurisdictions, I called him a murderer, a liar, a kidnapper, an accomplice to torture and kidnap, and a bogus scholar who had falsified 3 volumes of memoirs based on documents that he had stolen. And several of the reviewers in England said, well, if he doesn't sue on any of this, he's not much of a gentleman. Which I already knew, actually, to tell you the truth. So then for a long time, he wouldn't comment when he was asked. And in fact, at several occasions, including at the National Press Club in Washington, he made it a condition of his appearance that he not be asked any questions about me. And sometimes people, I'm afraid to say, agreed to those conditions. But finally he lost patience, because he did get asked, and he said, well, why should he answer to someone who'd abused Mother Teresa and denied the Holocaust? And I thought, what does he care about Mother Teresa? And what's he doing bringing this up? So I wrote to him, or through a lawyer I wrote to him, I've never done this before, and said, I'll see you in court if you don't take that back. And shouldn't you be suing me? And his lawyers replied the following day and said, our client undertakes not to repeat the allegation. And I wrote back saying, that's not good enough. You have to withdraw it. He obviously thought it was worth trying. It's a powerful smear. And he did retract it, and you can look it up on my website if you like, the correspondence between us. But that was a victory of a kind. I wanted to see him in court because I could then have brought witnesses from Chile, from East Timor, from Cyprus, from Cambodia, and so on. We were getting it ready. Who could say, well, yes, and furthermore, we can show that the plaintiff is, the defendant is a habitual liar and has lied on a number of things and makes a practice of lying and has made a career out of it. We were looking forward to it. So it was the apology I didn't want. But I repeat, the disgrace is that there is no proceeding against him by any organ of law or justice in the United States. The United States shelters him as a wanted war criminal, and that the United States opposes the establishment of an international criminal court because it knows that it is sheltering a wanted war criminal.
And he would certainly be defendant number one, I presume, in that court. In looking back over your work over the years, one of the things that I've always admired is the way that you have been very consistent in writing about human rights issues and human rights abuses wherever they occur. Eastern Europe and the Soviet era, Chile, South Africa, the Kurds, before anybody else was writing about them. You've always been a staunch backer of rights for the Palestinians, many other places as well. And unlike a lot of us, you actually seem to go to all these places. And I'm thinking, if the FBI and CIA have 150 pages on me, the intelligence services of many countries must have thousands of pages on you. And I'm wondering whether, in your travels, there have been any key experiences, key encounters that started you on this path, or were the key experiences, were they things that came before you started going to the various hotspots?
Well, you make me sound more intrepid than I am, Adam, but I would say, if you asked what was a formative or turning point experience for me, it would probably be, there would have been two in the last decade. One was my last visit to Kurdistan, to the Kurdish provinces of northern Iraq, at the end of the Gulf War, where I visited Halabja, the town that was destroyed with chemical weapons, and where the wounds that are inflicted by weapons like that stick around for a long time. They keep burning on people's skin and flesh, and you can see the stuff still sizzling on people. You can see them still suffering from it. And I have a photograph of myself sitting on the unexploded chemical bomb that the Iraqis left behind. They tried to destroy the evidence, but they left one behind, and there it is with their Air Force markings and so on. I mention it because sometimes there are people on the right, and some fools on the left too, who still try and deny that it was the Iraqis that did that. The point I'm making about why it had a big effect on me, though, is slightly different. It's this: I realized that here was an unintended consequence of the Gulf War, that by accident and as a result of massive international public opinion, because the Kurds ended that war, as you remember, scattered over the hillsides, starving and dispersed and dispossessed, there was a forcible international intervention to put an umbrella, a cover over them, which still exists. And so my question to those who talk too glibly about American imperialism is, would they now demand that American jets stop flying over Kurdistan, stop protecting the Kurds, or not? And if they would, I'd of course be very glad to hear their reasons, and if they wouldn't, would they examine those implications? Because I think they're quite important ones. Remember, there are, we think, probably not less than 30 million Kurds, maybe more, in Turkey, Iraq, Syria and Iran mainly, that they're the largest people in the world without a state, that they're the oldest cause of the left in the Middle East. I mention these things because it sometimes seems to me they don't get mentioned enough.
Do you see in your ideal future a state for all Kurds in all the countries in which they are, or autonomy within the countries in which they are? Just get utopian for a moment. What would you like to see?
Well, no, I think it's quite important not to demand, if you take a position of solidarity with some national movement, as for example, Edward Said and I produced a book of essays on the Palestine question back in 1982, before the last Intifada. And I've spoken countless times about this and written a lot about it, but I never want to take a position that is more militant, if you like, than the friends I have in this other movement. It seems to me for them to decide if they can compromise or not for me. And so when the Iraqi Kurdish leadership says, as it now does, it's content to be Iraqi, to say we are Iraqis, but we insist on being regarded as Kurds and granted autonomy, I don't think that's a betrayal, no. And since the Kurds in the neighboring countries also don't demand that they all be fused into one state, I don't feel that I'm being unduly moderate either. I think that's probably a fairly good rule of thumb. But I think they would be as justified in demanding a state as any other national minority with a common language and culture would be. And it's very much to their credit that they're willing, for the sake of a peaceful agreement, to give up quite a lot of their dignity and quite a lot of their history
to regimes that, for past good and sufficient reasons in the past, they have no reason to trust.
I think you were going to say, in the answer to my question before this, that there was another formative experience for you.
Well, there was. I just want to say one more thing about the Kurds before we're done. These guys are for regime change, okay? My Kurdish comrades are. They've been for it for a very long time. They've been fighting for it for a very long time. They've lost swaths of population fighting for it. They're not going to be cheated of it. They think this time they can get rid of Saddam Hussein. They have many brave Iraqi friends willing to join them on this. My solidarity is with them in case anyone wanted to ask me about it.
Okay.
I am for, and have always been for, those Kurds and Iraqis fighting for the overthrow and destruction of the Saddam Hussein regime. I was for regime change before any Bush family member was for it. And if necessary, I'll be for it long after they give it up. But I'm for it, okay? And the other one was Bosnia. I felt I had to go to Sarajevo during the siege of Sarajevo in 1992, and I hope no one will think I'm being Eurocentric if I say that, having seen terrible things before in Kurdistan, among other places, and Southern Africa and so forth, that I was kind of shocked to see a city in Europe being reduced to rubble and beggary and destruction, and its population put to the sword in the 90s. I didn't think I would have to endure that, let alone that they would have to, and the inhabitants of Mostar and many other cities too. And bad as that was, to see the Serbian Orthodox Christian racists trying to destroy Muslim Bosnia, but also the Catholic Christian Croatian fascists colluding with them in this operation, and with NATO colluding in the partition of Bosnia and dismemberment and destruction of Bosnia between these two forces. And it seemed to me quite essential that Europe, having watched the destruction of the Armenians by Turkey in the early part of the century, and then seen the attempt to destroy the whole of European Jewry made by German imperialism in the middle of the century, could not end the century by saying, well, let's have a Muslim minority destroyed too before we get the 20th century over with. To watch that would be impossible. And the fact remains that it was only by a tremendous struggle within the United States to change opinion in Congress and in the government that the necessary force was mobilized to prevent that from happening. And if that had not been done, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo would now be a howling wilderness, a post-genocidal howling wilderness. And again, in case anyone wanted to ask me about this, I'll state for the record, I don't regard that rescue operation as having been American imperialism.
One theme I see running through what you've written is an extreme dislike of organized religion. And I've heard you quoted as saying that if you died and went to heaven, you would be aghast to find that there was one. And recently, I think you said or wrote that for you the real axis of evil is Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Well, as they say on exam essay questions, expand and explain.
Being religious is like living in North Korea. You have endless opportunities to praise the leader, to thank him for giving you everything, to thank him for looking after you, to thank him for all his boundless gifts, to thank him for all his tireless efforts on your behalf. A celestial North Korea is what the religious believer wants. But there's one, I suppose there are two differences. You can defect from North Korea, and you can die and just cease to exist in North Korea. But if you're a religious believer, the leader goes on persecuting you after you're dead. You have to go on praising him forever and thanking him for being born and for all this. This is servility squared. It is the slave mentality. It's contemptible and cowardly, and it's the enemy of the intellect. It's the enemy of free inquiry. It's the enemy of reason. And what I would add is that those who practice it or preach it additionally piss me off by pretending that they're humble about this. They say, well, don't mind me, I'm just on an errand for God at the moment. I'm extremely modest about this, I'm very humble and abject, but it's just that God wants me to be doing this. And the reason why I'm ecumenical about it, I suppose, is because all of them partake of the same illusion. All monotheisms particularly partake of the same absurdities. And the Quran I regard as especially horrible because it validates both the claims of Christianity and of Judaism. I mean, the Quran insists that Jesus was a real prophet, and so were Moses and Abraham. So there you have the whole horrible thing in plain view. And the name of the religion, Islam, is simply the word for surrender, as it should be. And the posture of it is one of surrender and abjection, as it should be. And this is poison, frankly. And I have nothing but contempt for it. And in case you wonder if I can tell the sinner from the sin, I can, but I have a slight contempt for the people who believe it too. But if they'll keep it in the home where it belongs, I don't mind.
You've written that for you the September 11th attacks were a big turning point. Tell us about that.
Well, I've written that I think the cliche is true that September 11th is a big turning point, that it did alter a number of things, and I don't dissent for once. I mean, I like to always think, well, what's wrong with the prevailing cliche or the prevailing wisdom? But in this case, I thought, well, that's true. That's what the Germans call a Tendenswende. It's a turning point. For me, it wasn't that much of one on the essential question. I thought that the 14th of February 1989 was the turning point. And that was the day when my friend Salman Rushdie received a directly incited threat of murder, accompanied with an offer of bounty. In other words, murder solicited for pay in public, in his own name, from the theocratic leader of a foreign state, of which he Salman, was not a citizen, for writing a novel. And if you like, I'll say all that again. Some people forget what the fatwa was. I, the Ayatollah Khomeini, will offer money for your murder for writing a novel. And I'll also offer a ticket to paradise to anyone willing to attack you or those who helped you with the book. And I thought, well, there you have it. A perfectly arranged collision between all the things I hate and all the things I quite like. The things I quite like, by the way, are free expression, the right to write novels without death threats, and so on. And I remember President Bush the next day was asked, did he have a comment on this? And he said no. Why should he? This is President Bush Sr. As far as he was concerned, no American interests were involved. And I remember Susan Sontag pointing out, well, it would be paltry to say Mr. Rushdie's then wife was an American who'd had to go into hiding with him. Might it perhaps be said that American interests were involved in, say, the protection of novelists from state-supported terrorism? Anyway, you don't get that now. You wouldn't get that kind of sappy, stupid comment now, because the long period of underreaction to theocratic fascism is now over. But until September the 11th, what I thought was that there was a great deal of underreaction to it, and an unwillingness to confront it, an unwillingness to confront the threat that it represents, an unwillingness to realize how ruthless it was, how much it means business for us, how certain its defeat is, by the way, but how absolutely we must hurry that defeat along.
What about the other? What about the other two religions in your axis of evil there, and the theocratic fascist tendencies that they occasionally...
Not alone did President Bush show indifference that day, but the same day, Cardinal O'Connor of New York, a great prince of the church, announced that the problem was not the offer of money for murder by a religious leader, but the problem was profanity on the part of the author. He was joined in this by the Archbishop of Canterbury, by the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, and by the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel. In other words, there was a wonderful reverse ecumenical lineup of characters, all of whom said the problem is not the offer of murder for the destruction of literature, the problem is profanity. And I thought, well, I'm very glad that you guys have all sort of, as it were, clustered together, because there'll be more of a chance of getting you all with one grenade.
Okay, I want to move on to the subject.
Then you could make them into fertilizer, and then that'd be the first honest day's work they'd done in their lives if you spread them on the fields.
I want to move on to the subject that I think is on everybody's minds these last few months in the U.S., which is the possible war with Iraq. You have at times voiced general support for the prospect of going to war with Iraq. Are you still feeling that way? Under what circumstances? What would change it? Spell out your position for us.
Well, in the first place, I'm not for a war with Iraq, and I don't think there will be one. I've no quarrel with the Iraqi people or with the Iraqi nation, and I don't believe anyone else here does. However, there is going to be a confrontation with the Saddam Hussein regime, and it's being forced upon us. And the consequences, in my opinion, will occur whether or not there is a fight, because the Saddam Hussein regime is already imploding because of its own horrific internal character. And the dam of hatred and chaos and havoc that has built up behind the Ba'ath Party dictatorship, accumulated behind it over the last many years, will burst and spread in any case, so that you have two alternatives. Watch that happen and wonder what will occur, or intervene and see if you can try to condition it. Now, it seems to me that the second choice is the obvious one, and that those who've worked so patiently and bravely to bring this about should be the people we're working with. I mean by that particularly the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the PUK, but the Kurdish rebels in general, and the Iraqi National Congress. This should be not just a priority for the United States government, but it should be a priority of those citizens of the United States who consider themselves committed to human rights. If they imagine that just by watching it or staying neutral, they can, as it were, avoid or escape the consequences, they are quite clearly wrong. The Saddam Hussein regime has staked everything on the acquisition of the weapons of genocide. And if it was to acquire them, we know what it wants them for. It is also the sponsor of a great deal of international gangsterism. We're not completely certain of the extent of its connection with Mr. bin Laden. We know Mr. bin Laden supports Saddam Hussein. It's interesting. We don't know if Mr. Saddam Hussein necessarily supports Mr. bin Laden, but we know that the suicide bombers are supported and encouraged and paid for from Iraq. We know the Abu Nidal organization, which committed many murders among the Palestinian leadership, was supported and endorsed from Iraq. And we also know that there is a quite clear case to be made against Saddam Hussein for war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. And the United States government, were it not for its protection of Kissinger, would and should be bringing that case before the United Nations and the International Court of Justice. But those who care about these things should be pressing for more action and more careful action and more action based upon the principles of human rights and not less, and not being neutral about it.
But here, okay, both you and George Bush are talking about war with Iraq to eliminate Saddam Hussein. But beyond that, I sense that there are two different wars you're talking about. You're talking about, guaranteeing autonomy for the Kurds, pluralism, democracy, and so forth. But are those the purposes of Bush's war? And are the people that Bush is wanting to work with the same people that you would be wanting to work with to reconstruct Iraq after the war? After all, that general in Denmark who got arrested a couple of days ago, General Nizar Khazraji, who was one of the people I understand that the Bush people had tipped to lead an army in Iraq post-Saddam Hussein, he's now been indicted for his role in the gassing of the Kurds in the 1980s. So are you and George Bush talking about two different wars here?
There is a faction of the administration that would be happy just to have a military coup.
Just to have a
military coup in Baghdad. And has been working along those lines, and as you say, isn't very choosy about who it picks, and would settle for a military government. After all, that's what the CIA always does best. We can usually find you a general willing to take over. They haven't actually succeeded in that in this case. It wouldn't be the worst thing. It would be better than the status quo, and it would at least lead to an invitation to the inspectors and others to come in and identify and destroy the sites where weapons of genocide are being incubated. But no, you're quite right. It wouldn't satisfy me or the long-suffering Iraqi or Kurdish people. And then there's another thing which the administration won't say, but I know is split about. I mean, what this really is a war against Saudi Arabia. That's why the Saudis are so against the regime change in Iraq, and that's why they won't even let the base the United States built for them be used for it. Because they know that with Saddam gone, their buffer state and client is gone, and they also know that with the recuperation of Iraqi oil, their oil monopoly and oligopoly in the region, with which they've helped to spread bin Ladenism around the globe, is gone. And I can't wait for that bit to happen either. I accept the logical and probable consequences of this, in other words. There's going to be some terrific domino effect here. Sometimes you hear people on the left saying, well, it might destabilize the region. And I say, well, I've heard worse words than instability, actually, when it comes to the Saudi monarchy, for example. And there's an extraordinary boldness on the part of a wing, at least, of the Republican intellectuals, in that they've decided to make war on what they used to think of as their status quo. And I don't think that the sheer drama and interest of that and the possible excellent consequences are sufficiently discussed.
Well, if you talk about destabilizing the region, don't the recent election results in Pakistan and Turkey make you think that if things get riled up, it could in fact strengthen the forces of Muslim fundamentalism?
No, I don't, because for three reasons. One, well, there's a general reason which would apply to all of them. Even if these forces are elected, they will find you can't run a society out of the Quran. It can't, or any other holy book. It can't be done. It's been tried many times. It's a repeated failure. The most encouraging sign of this is the way that the Iranian people are already emerging on the other side of theocracy. They've thrown it off, especially the younger generation. They've repudiated it so far peacefully, and so far, I'm glad to say, without any outside help. It's the most single encouraging thing in the Middle East. That's why you never hear the peace movement types talk about the Iranian street. The Iranian street has about 70 million people. It's nearly as big as the Arab street, but people don't talk about it because the Iranian street is 100% pro-US policy, anti-Saddam Hussein, and anti-Mullah in the region. And we can hope for great things from that. By the same token, the Turkish electorate is simply having an election in which a party that has an Islamic inflection has won and is allowed a peaceful transition of power. That absolutely proves the secular character of Turkish society. It's a very encouraging development. And so, no, we can have the confidence that we're right about this. Only a secular society can guarantee freedom of religion, and only a secular society can offer any hope of progress. And the people will find that out either by learning it or finding it out from bitter experience.
Last August, you wrote the following: what the Iraqi and Kurdish Democrats would like is American aid for an endorsement of their own efforts to replace the regime. And what they fear is what I also fear, a heavy-handed U.S. attack which results in an Iraqi puppet government that is designed to placate the Saudis and the Turks. Now, have you changed your feeling on that point? Are you more optimistic that this is not going to happen?
Well, no, Adam, that's the earlier question you asked, but in a different way, or rather, as I might have answered it, some time ago. I just think the situation has moved on from that now. It's very obvious that it's very obvious that neither the Saudi authorities nor the Turkish military ones want such a thing to happen, and that if it does, it will be, therefore, by definition, overruling them. But it's also become much plainer that there's no status quo that can be protected by a non-intervention policy. In other words, if you don't intervene, if no one intervenes, the Saddam Hussein regime will collapse and bring great chaos and havoc in its wake in any case. It was very striking, I thought,
to see the other day what happened when after
the prisons.
When after humiliatingly forcing the Iraqi people not just to vote for him 100%, but to turn out for him 100%. I mean, to abnegate them and humiliate them one last time and force them to treat him like a god, and put them through that disgusting experience, that he said, well, let's open the jails, at least the jails that contain the rapists and pickpockets and pimps and murderers. In other words, I suppose the people he thought were his natural constituency. And find that within hours, the guards and the warders at the prison were helping to break down the bars and the walls and let out everybody, or at least everybody they could find, because most of the families who came to the prison gates found that their loved one isn't on the list of detainees, has been probably sawn in half on a table, and a video made of it for his family some time ago. And there were spontaneous demonstrations in the streets not long after that, and the police quite clearly had no instructions about how to deal with them. That's the Nicolae Ceausescu moment. That's the moment when the man's made his last mad speech from the balcony. He's beginning to go nuts, beginning to consider concessions. It means it's over morally, and it's about to be over politically. The only question is, are you going to help with the intervention, or are you going to be neutral about it? And even though I tried to hedge in what you quoted me as saying a few months ago, I was at least clear on what side I was on.
What about the factor of oil? I mean, would Bush be so eager to launch this war if what Iraq had the world's first or second largest proven reserves of was, say, potatoes rather than oil? The Cheney energy plan, the one that the Enron folks helped him write, has the U.S. rising, of course, spurns all talk of alternative energy, and has the U.S. rising to importing 2/3 of its oil by the year 2020. And Ahmed Chalabi, whom Rumsfeld and Cheney seem to want to install as the leader of Iraq, told the Washington Post recently, American companies will have a big shot at Iraqi oil. And the Heritage Foundation has already put out a detailed plan for privatizing Iraq's oil industry, mostly into American hands. Does that concern you?
My view has always been, you should never be deterred from doing the right thing by the thought that it might also be in your interests. Sorry, didn't hear that? No. I'll say it again. You should never be deterred from doing the right thing by the thought that it might also be in your own interests. There's only one country that can hope to rebuild the Iraqi oil industry. Let's be realistic. The Iraqi oil industry is now working on stuff that's about 20 years out of date. Probably they could pump twice as much oil as they do now with an overhaul just of the equipment that they're using. It would take a few billion in a couple of years, but it could be done. And it would no longer be oil just being drilled for the feeding and keeping of a barbaric military and party elite who use it to finance aggression and genocide. The only country that's capable of this undertaking is the United States. The French won't do it because, or rather I hope Mr. Chalabi doesn't let them do it, because they've been bribed by Mr. Saddam Hussein up till now, as have the Russians, with oil contracts in the other direction. Yes, there's going to be some hardball played about that, but it's very essential, it seems to me, that the oil resources of the region be not in the hands of someone who threatens to blow them up or to irradiate them if his rule is challenged. In other words, do you want to see what it would be like for the world economy if he was in a position to threaten or to do that or to repeat what he did to the Kuwaiti oil fields last time, when I remind you he set them on fire while on his way out? This is the question we'll have to... You hear people say, no war over oil. Are they listening to what they're saying? What they're saying is oil isn't worth fighting about. Who really believes that? Come on. Be serious, get real. So, that's impressive. That's 6 people who really believe that. That's amazing. I'm amazed there are 6 people in America who think oil isn't worth fighting over, but lots of luck.
But wait a minute, you're saying that the oil is worth fighting over?
I'm saying it's essential to fight over it, yes. I'm saying it's essential that it not be the possession of a maniacal, sabotaging despot, yes.
All right, but are there not better alternatives to it than it being in possession of American oil companies?
Are we going to do wind power now,
Adam. I mean, I'm willing to talk about alternative energy if you like, but that's not the question we're being faced with now.
Well,
I mean, if you're asking me, while we wait to see what Saddam Hussein wants, shall we talk about solar panels? I guess we could, but I think it would be a rather insipid conversation.
okay. All right. But, okay. We're going to open things up to microphones on the floor in a second, but I want to get in another question or two first. All right. I want to come back to the oil thing, but look at the larger context in which Bush's war push is taking place. My fear is that the...
I'll close on the implied question that Bill asked me earlier. Why don't you accept this wonderful offer? Why wouldn't you like to meet Shakespeare, for example? I mean, I don't know if you really think that when you die you can be corporeally reassembled and have conversations with authors from previous epochs. It's not necessary that you believe that in Christian theology, and I have to say it sounds like a complete fairy tale to me. The only reason I want to meet Shakespeare, or might even want to, is because I can meet him any time, because he is immortal in the works he's left behind. If you've read those, meeting the author would almost certainly be a disappointment. But when Socrates was sentenced to death for his philosophical investigations and for blasphemy, for challenging the gods of the city, and he accepted his death, he did say, well, if we are lucky, perhaps I'll be able to hold conversation with other great thinkers and philosophers and doubters too. In other words, that the discussion about what is good, what is beautiful, what is noble, what is pure and what is true could always go on. Why is that important? Why would I like to do that? Because that's the only conversation worth having. And whether it goes on or not after I die, I don't know. But I do know that it's the conversation I want to have while I'm still alive. Which means that to me, the offer of certainty, the offer of complete security, the offer of an impermeable faith that can't give way, is an offer of something not worth having. I want to live my life taking the risk all the time that I don't know anything like enough yet, that I haven't understood enough, that I can't know enough, that I'm always hungrily operating on the margins of a potentially great harvest of future knowledge and wisdom. I wouldn't have it any other way. And I'd urge you to look at those of you who tell you, those people who tell you at your age that you're dead till you believe as they do. What a terrible thing to be telling to children. And that you can only live, and that you can only live by accepting an absolute authority. Don't think of that as a gift. Think of it as a poisoned chalice. Push it aside, however tempting it is. Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Chapter 9. The Quran is borrowed from both Jewish and Christian myths. The doings and sayings of Moses and Abraham and Jesus, being so ill-founded and so inconsistent, as well as so often immoral, one must proceed in the same spirit of inquiry to what many believe is the last revelation, that of the Prophet Muhammad and his Quran or recitation. Here again, the angel or archangel, Gabriel, is found at work, dictating surahs or verses to a person of little or no learning. Here again are stories of a Noah-like flood and injunctions against idol worship. Here again the Jews are the first recipients of the message, and the first both to hear it and to discard it. And here again there is a vast commentary of doubtful anecdote about the actual doings and sayings of the Prophet, this time known as the Hadith. Islam is at once the most and the least interesting of the world's monotheisms. It builds upon its primitive Jewish and Christian predecessors, selecting a chunk here and a shard there, and thus if these fall, it partly falls also. Its founding narrative likewise takes place within an astonishingly small compass, and relates facts about extremely tedious local quarrels. None of the original documents, such as they are, can be contrasted with any Hebrew or Greek or Latin texts. Almost all of the tradition is oral,
and all of it is in Arabic. Indeed, many authorities agree that the Quran is only intelligible in that tongue, which is itself subject to innumerable idiomatic and regional inflections. This would leave us on the face of it with the absurd and potentially dangerous conclusion that God was a monoglot. Before me is a book introducing Muhammad, written by two extremely unctuous British Muslims who are hoping to present a friendly version of Islam to the West. Ingratiating and selective as their text may be, they insist that, as the literal word of God, the Quran is the Quran only in the original revealed text. A translation can never be the Quran. That inimitable symphony, the very sound of which moves men and women to tears. A translation can only be an attempt to give the barest suggestion of the meaning of words contained in the Quran. This is why all Muslims, whatever their mother tongue, always recite the Quran in its original Arabic. The authors go on to make some highly disobliging observations about the Penguin translation by N.J. Dawood, which makes me glad that I have always employed the Pictorial version, but no likely to be convinced that if I wish to become a convert, I must master another language. In my own country of birth, I'm sadly aware that there is a beautiful, poetic tradition unavailable to me because I will never know the marvellous tongue called Gaelic. Even if God is or was an Arab, an unsafe assumption, how could he expect to reveal himself by way of an illiterate person who in turn could not possibly hope to pass on the unaltered, let alone unalterable, words? The point may seem minor, but it is not. To Muslims, the enunciation of the divine to a person of extreme unlettered simplicity has something of the same value as the humble vessel of the Virgin Mary has to Christians. It also possesses the same useful merit of being entirely unverifiable and unfalsifiable. Since Mary must be presumed to have spoken Aramaic and Muhammad Arabic, it can, I suppose, be granted that God is in fact multilingual and can speak any language he chooses. He opted in both cases to use the Archangel Gabriel as the intermediate deliverer of his message. However, the impressive fact remains that all religions have staunchly resisted any attempt to translate their sacred texts into languages understanded of the people, as the Cranmer Prayer Book phrases it. There would have been no Protestant Reformation if it were not for the long struggle to have the Bible rendered into the Vulgate, and the priestly monopoly therefore broken. Devout men like Wycliffe, Coverdale, and Tyndale were burned alive for even attempting early translations. The Catholic Church has never recovered from its abandonment of the mystifying Latin ritual, and the Protestant mainstream has suffered hugely from rendering its own Bibles into more everyday speech. Some mystical Jewish sects still insist on Hebrew and play Kabbalistic word games, even with the spaces between letters, but, among most Jews too, the supposedly unchangeable rituals of antiquity have been abandoned. The spell of the clerical class has been broken. Only in Islam has there been no reformation, and to this day, any vernacular version of the Quran must still be printed with an Arabic parallel text. This ought to arouse suspicion, even in the slowest mind. Later Muslim conquests, impressive in their speed and scope and decisiveness, have lent point to the idea that these Arabic incantations must have had something to them. But if you allow this cheap earthly victory as a proof, you allow the same to Joshua's blood-soaked tribesmen, or to the Christian crusaders and conquistadors. There is a further objection. All religions take care to silence or to execute those who question them, and I choose to regard this recurrent tendency as a sign of their weakness rather than their strength. It has, however, been some time since Judaism and Christianity resorted openly to torture and censorship. Not only did Islam begin by condemning all doubters to eternal fire, but it still claims the right to do so in almost all of its dominions, and still preaches that these dominions can and must be extended by war. There has never been an attempt in any age to challenge or even investigate the claims of Islam that has not been met with extremely harsh and swift repression. Provisionally, then, one is entitled to conclude that the apparent unity and confidence of the faith is a mask for a very deep and probably justifiable insecurity. That there are, and always have been, sanguinary feuds between different schools of Islam, resulting in strictly inter-Muslim accusations of heresy and profanity, and in terrible acts of violence, naturally goes without saying. I have tried my best with this religion, which is as foreign to me as it is to the many millions who will always doubt that God entrusted a non-reader, through an intermediary, with the demanding call to read. As I said, I long ago acquired a copy of the Marmaduke Pictorial translation of the Quran, which has been certified by senior sources in the ulema, or Islamic religious authority, to be the nearest to an approximate rendition into English. I have been to innumerable gatherings, from Friday prayers in Tehran to mosques in Damascus and Jerusalem and Doha and Istanbul and Washington, D.C., and I can attest that the recitation in Arabic does indeed have the apparent power to create bliss and also rage among those who hear it. I have also attended prayers in Malaysia and Indonesia and Bosnia, where there is resentment among non-Arabic-speaking Muslims at the privilege granted to Arabs and to Arabic, and to Arab movements and regimes, in a religion that purports to be universal. I have in my own home received Sayyid Hossein Khomeini, grandson of the Ayatollah, and a cleric from the holy city of Qum, and carefully handed him my own copy of the Quran. He kissed it, discussed it at length and with reverence, and for my instruction wrote in the back flap the verses which he thought had disproved his grandfather's claim to clerical authority in this world, as well as overthrown his grandfather's claim to take the life of Salman Rushdie. Who am I to adjudicate in such a dispute? However, the idea that the identical text can yield different commandments to different people is quite familiar to me for other reasons. There's no need to overstate the difficulty of understanding Islam's alleged profundities. If one comprehends the fallacies of any revealed religion, one comprehends them all. I have only once, in 25 years of often heated arguments in Washington, D.C., been threatened with actual violence. This was when I was at dinner with some staffers and supporters of the Clinton White House. One of those present, a then well-known Democratic pollster and fundraiser, questioned me about my own most recent trip to the Middle East. He wanted my opinion as to why the Muslims were so all-fired goddamn fundamentalists. I ran through my repertoire of explanations, adding that it was often forgotten that Islam was a relatively young faith and still in the heat of its self-confidence. Not for Muslims the crisis of self-doubt that had overtaken Western Christianity. I added that, for example, while there was little or no evidence for the life of Jesus, the figure of the Prophet Muhammad was by contrast a person in ascertainable history. The man changed colour faster than anyone I've ever seen. After shrieking that Jesus Christ had meant more to more people than I could ever imagine, and that I was disgusting beyond words for speaking so casually, he drew back his foot and aimed a kick which only his decency, conceivably his Christianity, prevented him from landing on my shin. He then ordered his wife to join him in leaving. I now feel that I owe him an apology, or at least half of one. Although we do know that a person named Muhammad almost certainly existed within a fairly small bracket of time and space, we have the same problem as we do in all the precedent cases. The accounts that relate his deeds and words were assembled many years later and are hopelessly corrupted into incoherence by self-interest, rumour, and illiteracy. The tale is familiar enough, even if it is new to you. Some Meccans of the 7th century followed an Abrahamic tradition and even believed that their temple, the Kaaba, had been built by Abraham. The temple itself, most of its original furnishings having been destroyed by later fundamentalists, notably the Wahhabis, is said to have become depraved by idolatry. Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, became one of those Hunafa, who turned away to seek solace elsewhere. The book of Isaiah also enjoins true believers to come out from the ungodly and be separate. Retiring to a desert cave on Mount Hira for the month of heat, or Ramadan, he was asleep or in a trance, I'm quoting Pictoul's commentary, when he heard a voice commanding him to read. He replied twice that he was unable to read, and was thrice commanded to do so. Eventually asking what he should read, he was further commanded in the name of a Lord who created man from a clot of blood. After the angel Gabriel, who so identified himself, had told Muhammad that he was to be Allah's messenger and had departed, Muhammad confided in his wife, Khadija. On their return to Mecca, she took him to meet her cousin, an elderly man named Waraka ibn Nufal, who knew the scriptures of the Jews and Christians. This whiskered veteran declared that the divine envoy who once visited Moses had come again to Mount Hira. From then on, Muhammad adopted the modest title of Slave of Allah, the latter word being simply the Arabic for God.
My fear is that is less the repercussions of the war against Iraq, but the fact that it's happening in the framework of his doctrine of asserting the right to make a preemptive strike and impose regime change wherever it wishes, wherever it wants to. Now, you and I may favor regime change in Iraq, but Kissinger was in the business of regime change. And if Bush has established this, establishes the precedent of being able to do this at will in Iraq, are we not worried about where he's going to do it next? What about Brazil, for example, where a government has taken power much disliked in Washington? It doesn't worry you?
That's a very good counterposition, but I think you'll see at once that between moving into Chile, overthrowing a government that has a constitution and that does have elections, and murdering its elected president, and moving into Iraq and sponsoring political parties and elections and destroying a dictatorship, there is a difference, and not just a factual one or a practical one, but also a moral one. In the northern provinces of Iraq, the provinces that are currently under American protection that I mentioned before, there are, to my knowledge, 21 newspapers, several political parties. A friend of mine, Dr. Bahram Salih, a very fine guy, has just been elected the Prime Minister of that part of Kurdistan. This means that we're not just bluffing or fantasizing or being utopian when we say that we have some achievements to point to. In the meanwhile, in Bahrain, in Qatar, and to some extent in Kuwait, elections are being held, women are being allowed to vote in them and run in them. Where it can be discovered where the pressure for this comes from, it's the United States supporting this process, not opposing it. And as for the old cases of the banana republics in South America, I think you can see from the Inspector Clouseau-like performance of the Bush administration over the Chavez coup that never was, that the will to act in that way in the countries that now constitute the OAS has simply evaporated. There will not be a return to government by coup in South America. And if there is, what was I talking about when I said Chavez, big boy? Colombia. And look at Argentina. It's had no government for nearly a year now. It barely has a pulse. It hardly has a currency. Does the army want it? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. The army doesn't want it. They say we have to leave this to civil society, or maybe they're just cynical and say we don't want the responsibility. No, but the era of the military banana republic regime in Latin America is, in my judgment, over. There's only one military regime now in the region, which is Cuba. There's only one regime in the area that is run by men in uniform, and it's in Havana. And of that one, I think probably the United States wouldn't mind a regime changing. Well, but that's an old story.
In the
not a very creditable one, alas.
In the 1980s, Wolfowitz and Pearl were calling for a U.S. Military invasion of Cuba. And you don't have any fear that...
No one's calling for it now. It's not even on the axis of evil.
But
Cuba occasionally people like John Bolton remember to insult Fidel, the maximum leader, but the fact of the matter is, as everyone in this room knows, one way or another, the thing has run so far out of steam that everyone's just waiting for it to end in its own way, and there's no need for a fight over it. That's the situation. Sad in a way, because the Cuban Revolution once meant a good deal to the people of Cuba and to the neighboring countries too, and it's one says this with some regret, but it has to be faced. But no, there was not going to be a return to the golpe and the caudillo in South America, and we would know by now if there was going to be.
I'm going to ask you one final question about the Iraq War, and then I think it's probably time to open up the mics on the floor. And my final question is this. Imagine that you are Osama bin Laden. You're sitting in your cave in Afghanistan or Pakistan, or maybe in your luxury apartment in Lahore, or maybe in the basement of a mosque in Saudi Arabia. We don't know. Wherever you are, you're thinking, what's going to be my best recruiting tool? Would not a U.S. invasion of Iraq be at the top of your list?
I can't think why he thinks. I mean, I'm interested that you pick this, because implied in this is the idea that Mr. bin Laden takes the Iraqi side, or the Saddam Hussein side in this dispute. And that is indeed implied or suggested in his own broadcasts. He refers to an attack on Iraq as being an attack on the Muslim world, right? As if the Kurds were not Muslims, for example. They're Sunni Muslim. As if Ahmed Chalabi wasn't a Muslim. He's Shia Muslim. As if any replacement government in Iraq wouldn't be Muslim. As if the Northern Alliance isn't Muslim. These are the ways in which Mr. bin Laden shows to us that he's blinded by his own fatuous, limited, primitive ideology. It's this that's done us the great favor. It seems to me that if things had gone on as they were before the 11th of September the year before last year, excuse me, there was every chance that the Talibanization of Pakistan, a process that was well underway, would have been completed. Within the Pakistani secret police and army, there was a strong process of Talibanization to which the United States government was practically indifferent. It was about to take over the Pakistani state with its nuclear weapons. And it was drawing with complete complacency on support from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. This movement was gaining ground everywhere. Mr. bin Laden completely ruined the plan, because for him it's not enough to be a fundamentalist or a fanatic. For him there must be a grand opera. There must be the real gesture of propaganda by deed and martyrdom and sacrifice. And he has made it certain. He has made it certain that for as long as he's willing to keep on trying it, his network will be broken and broken again, and he will have to hide his face. He will have to admit, as he has already had to, that he left behind the people of Afghanistan with his Taliban friends. They fled under cover of night, the people who they tortured and oppressed. They did not meet the infidel in battle, but they ran away. They hide now in holes, and they can hear from us at any time they want. You wish martyrdom, we are here to help. Let me add one more thing about Mr. bin Laden, because I'm really shocked how little attention it's got. If it's true, as it seems to be, that this statement is originally from him, I hope you noticed his justification for the mass murder of tourists in Bali, in Indonesia. Did you? He said Australians have to be punished because of the role of Australia in assisting the independence of East Timor. Now, what the Australians did was little enough to supervise the evacuation of Indian troops from East Timor and the eventual independence of the territory, but it was Australia's responsibility under the UN. And Mr. bin Laden now says this means we must kill Australians wherever we find them because they have separated a Christian people from Muslim Indonesia. If you want it put any more plainly than that, what you're looking at, that you're staring right down the gun barrel of fascism, I don't know if there's any plainer way.
Okay. So.
I'd like to lay down just a few rules for the question period. First of all, if you'd like to ask a question, I think there's 2 mics. You can line up at the mics and we can go back and forth. We're going to let our Young Activist Award winners ask the first questions if they want to. Do you want to? Okay, so Harmony and Genevieve, could you go to you? Second thing is, please actually ask a question. It's like Jeopardy. So, you can turn any statement into a question, but you have to do that so that Christopher or Adam can respond to it. And finally, we'd like to give as many people an opportunity to speak as possible. So you'll have about a minute to make your point. And when there are 15 seconds left, I'll hit my high-tech timer.
Okay. So again, my name's Harmony. I wanted to ask, I do want to put out a statement, right, and then ask a question that results from it.
She's already made a statement.
Oh, it's just a quick point, right? Because
already had a lot of time at the mic.
It's okay. I want to raise the question. I don't know what's happening.
Are you standing?
I don't know. Is that okay? It is the question. To me, the question is the question of imperialism. And it's not a question of, is this an abstract left analysis on the question of imperialism? The people who are in power right now have been very explicit in the newspaper, in their plans, that they're trying to build an American empire. And I hear what you're saying, and you have a lot of factual information to back up what you're saying, but I want to hear how you can justify any kind of U.S. intervention when they're very explicit that what their agenda is to build an American empire.
Okay. One at a time? Well, here's the situation. The United States has been attacked itself on its own soil by an internationally coordinated movement, which is also attacking in different forms innumerable other societies, well, not innumerable, numerous, from Nigeria to Indonesia. The way I would phrase it would be this: there's a civil war going on in the Muslim world. It's been going on for some time. The side that wants to impose the Sharia, the absolutist, theocratic form of Islam, has not much chance of winning this war, but it's a war on a very, very big front. It wants to win it by bringing the war to the United States and to European societies, which means we can't be neutral in the war, which is a war that goes on rather a large front, in fact is global. Thus, yes, there will have to be for a very long time a globalized sense of engagement and commitment to make sure that our Muslim allies, who also don't want to live under Sharia theocracy, do not lose this international civil war. If some overambitious neoconservative types choose to call this an imperial responsibility on the part of the United States, I don't think that they very much overstate it. I wish they would find a better word or a more elegant term for it. But the brute facts of the situation are as I have described them, unless anyone can find a way of evading this challenge or this responsibility. And I don't find, as I go around talking about this, that anybody can. So glib talk about imperialism gets you nowhere. Well, it gets animal noises out of some people. But if they could hear themselves doing it, they wouldn't, believe you me.
Questions that you're having from the audience makes me want to ask you, where do you think the left is going now with this new kind of war? Usually our enemies are people that are really good guys, and in this case we have Islam fundamentalists, and I have noticed that the left is absent on so many things. For example, when Iraq beheaded all these women and a lot of human rights groups were pretty upset about it, the left didn't say anything because it wasn't clear. So these are the kinds of things that keep me up at night, and I'm wondering, I think they keep you up at night too, where do you think the left is hitting and where would you like them to hit? And is there a left that you think is a responsible response to what's happening in the changing world?
Well, you know, I mean, I'm really tempted to take that as a statement, and a very good one too. I mean, not just of your own observation that the left has failed a lot of these tests, but of the realization that something ought to be done about it. But I hope I've given you an idea of what I would think about that by now. Have I not? I mean, if people really think I haven't, I'll have another try. But if you take the case of say September the 11th, you have an organization that is partly a really corrupt multinational, I'm talking about Al-Qaeda now, partly a really corrupt multinational corporation run by Saudi capital and supported by the Saudi oligarchy and the Pakistani secret police. It's partly that. It's partly a crime family. It's partly a cult organization, and it's partly a fascist cult group. This is, I think, an enemy, right? A pretty reactionary enemy, a pretty obvious. It's not just that its methods are the mass destruction of civilians, using civilian aviation to inflict further death of civilians, but its objective is a Stone Age society without music, culture, philosophy, dialectic of any kind at all. The model of being Taliban Afghanistan. It's not my objection to their means, it's to their objectives. This attack puts the working class of New York in the driving seat, in the saddle. It makes a direct attack on democracy and on secularism and on pluralism, and by the indiscriminate nature of its tactics on everything that we hold dear by way of the multicultural ethic. Hundreds of Muslims are killed in those attacks, people from every nationality as well. You couldn't really have a more clear confrontation between, let's at least say, left liberalism and the right. And the left says, well, I don't know, what about East Timor? This is disgraceful. To try and evade, to try and sit out a moment like that really invites historical condemnation. of the kind that you can't appeal to later. You can't say, well, I'm sorry, maybe I think differently. You're tested by how you react at a moment like that. Just as you are indeed when you read the reports of planned and organized genocide in northern Iraq, which we have. We have all the evidence to charge under the Genocide Convention. And the Genocide Convention, by the way, mandates immediate action by any state as soon as the information is received, either to prevent or to punish. People who are looking for neutral or evasive positions here, I think, do not deserve the name radical. So what you're really asking me is this, is to say what I've come to believe, which is that a very large number of the American left have become a status quo force. And what they really wish about all this is that it hadn't come up, and it hadn't happened, and we didn't have to think about it, because then they could go on with their domestic agenda, whatever that turns out to be. Perhaps prescription drugs for seniors. As you say, sir. As you so rightly say.
I find your allegiance to the Kurds admirable, and a number of other points of your...
Michael, could you stand back a little?
Your allegiance to the Kurds is admirable, and a number of the other points you're making are very sound from, as it were, a local or a regional perspective. But by talking about the evils elsewhere, enables you to simplify the situation and kind of slide off from addressing the question directly, which I'd like you to deal with directly. There's deep concern here about the triumphalism and ascendancy of the United States, not in abstract terms, but in a real historical situation in which its driving forces and character are in hands, how can I say it delicately, worse than they have ever been in my life. Okay? I never thought I wish to have Richard Nixon back as just a simple egomaniacal thug. He looks like Mother Teresa, looks like, by comparison. Okay, would you please address this question directly? What about the problems with American ascendancy in this situation?
Well, after what you've said about Dick, I think you'll have to admit that even if you accuse me of being simple, you are confused. I can't say everything each time. Your question wasn't very direct. But if you want me to say what the misgivings are, it's pretty easy to do. Let me give you an example. Judge Garzon in Spain, who was the heroic judge in the Pinochet case, and in many other human rights cases, not long after September 11th, apprehended the first al-Qaeda cell that was fully busted in Europe. It was in Madrid. He had them all collared and locked down before the FBI and the CIA had even really worked out that there'd been an attack of any kind at all. And incidentally, when is anyone going to be fired at the FBI and the CIA for being asleep at the switch on this? And for eating such a gigantic share of the national security budget and leaving us defenseless under open skies? Don't ask. Anyway, Judge Garzon has got them. He got a team, 6 of them. But he said, I'm willing to hand them over. He said, but I can't hand them over to any country that has capital punishment, because European law forbids that. You can't extradite people to a nation that is going to execute them. This is the only country comparable to itself that retains the barbaric practice of capital punishment. Now, John Ashcroft, as he's recently shown in the Malvo case and others, prefers the exercise of capital punishment to the doing of justice, of course, but he also prefers it to law and order. The fetishizing of this filthy human sacrifice penalty means more to him than, say, cooperation with someone like Judge Garzon in the fight against terrorism. That's what tells you what you're up against. People who are ideological fanatics and not competent to defend us from enemies either foreign or domestic. Furthermore, in their grandiosity, they insist on saying, well, all this is designed to make sure that American superiority goes on militarily now and forever and can never be challenged by any other power. Which means to say, you're saying also to people in Spain and Britain and Germany, by the way, if you want to join us and help fight what is after all a common threat, we want you to know your soldiers are dying for American supremacy and superiority. It's not a very brilliant way of proceeding.
or of achieving solidarity. And I could go on, and I hope you wouldn't doubt me, as I've generated in print and on screen a number of other criticisms of this kind. But don't mistake me. I'm bringing these up because I'm committed to a pitiless and conclusive victory in this war. And I'm not bringing up these criticisms for any other reason, and I don't trust anyone who I suspect of doing so.
Yes. Hi. Professor Adams kind of asked you about two main areas, which is Henry Kissinger book and then the war in Iraq. But there was an area in which you wrote extensively, and that is the question of Palestine. So my question is, could you please expand and comment on the situation in Palestine right now and on the Palestinian movement for justice and liberation? Thank you.
Well, I think I may have to ventriloquize the questioner, he asked me for my comments on the present state of affairs in Palestine. He doesn't ask anything very specific. I don't feel just like running off at the mouth about what I think about what's going on.
Well, you should. It's a subject worth running.
Yeah, but I'd like to be asked a question, if you know what I mean. It's like saying, talk about yourself. You know, you suddenly think,
all right,
well, I know the subject, but I wonder what the hell...
I have a question more specific.
The question would be...
Is the two-state solution still viable in your...
That's much better. That's a lot better. Thank you. Well, that's much better because it dramatizes something very important. It's quite clear that the present government in Israel hopes to avoid it or forestall a two-state solution by completing the annexation of the occupied territories as quickly as it can and pronouncing that a fait accompli by making it undoable. Some people, Meron Ben-Venisti for one, Eyal Weizmann for another, have produced impressive documentation suggesting that the annexation of the territories is already nearly complete. And this, of course, very much reduces the pressure on Palestinians to consider a two-state solution as their program either. And one of the appalling consequences or causes of that, because I believe it to be both cause and consequence, is the decision by some Palestinian organizations to conduct attacks within Israel itself upon kibbutzim or old people's homes or civilian targets within the borders of pre-1967 Israel, and suicide attacks, murder attacks in Jerusalem and elsewhere, which quite clearly express the intention to remove all Jews from Palestine. Now, that is, of course, precisely the propaganda with which Ariel Sharon would like to deal, because it justifies his own rejectionism. And in my opinion, the Palestinian parliament, for example, would already have voted Mr. Arafat out, as it nearly did, if Mr. Sharon hadn't confined Mr. Arafat in Ramallah. So there's another negative dialectic here, if you like, another negative ecumenicism, where the thuggish elements on both sides feed upon one another. Well, here, clearly, a very special responsibility descends upon the United States, which has the power to arrest these settlements and the power to enforce a solution, and instead pretends to be both a mediator while in fact it's a participant. And that seems to me something that American voters and citizens should long ago have forced them to decide about. Is the United States a mediator in the Palestine dispute, or is it the patron and armorer and financier of one side in it? We can't go on like this much longer.
You're being very good. Keeping to time limits. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Joseph Anderson, and I say that to say that if anyone's interested, they can plug my name into a search box in the Berkeley Daily Planet or the San Francisco Chronicle and read a letter that I wrote about the former SFM on 12/16/00, December 16, 2000, and in the San Francisco Chronicle on December 18, 2000. I would like to say that I've had an amiable acquaintanceship with Christopher Hitchens. I've agreed with him on some issues, disagreed with him on other issues, and I dare say corrected him on still others. I must say that I'm shocked that a Mario Savio Award recipient was not allowed her free speech to make a comment tonight, but restricted only to a question. I would welcome a real debate such as this in almost any other venue, but I believe that a pseudo-debate, hardly even a debate like this, where we have a lecturer who's pro-war in Yugoslavia, pro-war in Afghanistan, and pro-war in Iraq, is an insult to the memory of Mario Savio. And I hate to say this, but I believe that Lynn Hollander Savio has become the Coretta Scott King to the memory of Mario Savio.
Okay, excuse me.
This is an insult.
Why don't you guys clap that too? Why don't you clap that too?
This should not be
clap.
allowed
Go on, clap.
to happen.
Monkey.
Excuse me, could we have the next question, please?
The Guardian news...
Contemptible remark. Shameful, contemptible remark by a guy who always comes to my readings, always takes up everybody's time, always awards himself airtime, and never buys one of my damn books. Probably because he can't read.
You talk more than almost anyone I know.
Okay.
No, leave him there. Leave him there. It's fine. Leave him there.
Could you go on with the next question, please?
The Guardian newspaper...
You knew what you looked like, mister.
Its comments on when you compare what they said about September 11th, you compare it to what they wrote about the sarin gas attack in Tokyo or the bombing of the Oklahoma Federal Building. In your opinion, what about September 11th was so attractive to the Guardian newspaper?
I didn't get the last sentence, I'm sorry.
In your opinion, what about the September 11th attack was so attractive to the editorial staff of the Guardian newspaper? Manchester Guardian, so it's your countrymen.
What about the September 11th attack was so attractive to the editorial staff of the Manchester Guardian? That's an extraordinary question. I mean, I don't really think it's a proper question for me. I've no insight into their editorial processes. If you mean why did September the 11th get more coverage than, say, the sarin gas in the Tokyo subway, which I believe you mentioned.
Why did they not condemn the September 11th?
Why did the Guardian not condemn the September 11th attacks? Someone asked. Well, I'm sorry. We have a planetary difference here.
You managed to do this whole presentation I agree with you 100% on the crimes of religion. We have no disagreement on that. But you did not once in your presentation mention the fact that the United States, which you are defending, is responsible through its military and economic arms for the deaths of tens of millions of people in the world every year. Compared to what the Muslim fundamentalists, by the way, who were largely created as a political force by the United States, and are still in many places used by the United States as a political force against the left where necessary. Compared to them, though, compared to the United States oppression and murder around the world, these fundamentalists are small-time players. And if anybody but these fundamentalists killed 3,000 Americans in retaliation for what the U.S. did, I think a reasonable person could say it was a drop in the bucket for what the U.S. really has coming as a nation. Thank you.
And thank you, too.
Did you want to comment?
No, of course not.
Hi. My name's Abe Gardner. I'm with the Berkeley ACLU. I'm an executive with Common Cause of California at Berkeley, and I'm with Democracy Matters on campus. I'd like to ask you a question regarding oil. I feel as though the response that you gave to the question earlier was indeed interesting and has an interesting point, but I'd like to know more about if Saddam Hussein were to gain weapons of mass destruction, and if he had the ability to control up to 44% of the oil reserves of the world in that region as a result due to change or a shift in the balance of power, I don't understand how you can justify a claim that this is not a war about oil, particularly given the political interests of the Bush family.
But, my dear sir, did I not plainly say that anyone who didn't think oil was worth fighting about was a fool? That clearly it's a war about oil.
You said before...
That oil is worth fighting over, must be fought over, if it's not to become the property of megalomaniac, pyromaniac despots. Yes, I most certainly did.
I mean, in terms of the power of the United States in the oil industry, rather than the money going to a specific person who you clearly disagree with. Thank you.
I mean, people used to say there were braver slogans in the old days, like "No blood for Texaco," for example, or, and I remember it myself, the obvious fact that the United States government had overthrown an elected regime in Iran, the Mossadegh regime in the 1950s, in order to get a preponderance of American oil companies over British ones in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Corporation. This was all great stuff. We could do real populism then about empire, oil, and attacks on democracy. The sad thing is that none of it applies now, as you can see from the whimperingly no-good slogans that you get, like "No war over oil," which means nothing unless you think oil is unimportant. Now, it bears on an important question that hasn't come up, which I might just take a minute on. Many people say, look, Saddam Hussein may be horrible. Everyone likes to clear their throat this way and say they don't really like him. Everyone except Ramsey Clark and a few fans of the Ba'ath Party want to get this out of the way. Of course, we agree he's a bad guy. But, you know, he understands self-preservation, he understands deterrence, he can be boxed in, and so forth. Now, having invaded Kuwait, which was an insane thing for him to have done, and having refused pressure from almost every member of the Arab League, the whole of the United Nations, and every other conceivable neighbor or international group to withdraw his forces, Saddam Hussein was told by a note delivered personally by James Baker that he was going to be pushed out by a coalition that involved the Egyptian army, the Syrian army, the French army, everyone you can think of. But there was no chance that he could resist being pushed out, but he was to not do two things. He was not to try and use nerve or chemical gas agents on American or coalition forces, on pain of what were called the most extreme and severe consequences. And he was not to set fire to the Kuwaiti oil fields before he abandoned them. Now, we don't know, at least I will claim I don't know, whether the Gulf War syndrome and some other illnesses do result from some rash commander, perhaps with orders, trying out nerve gas in that war or not. The jury's out on that. There's a strong suspicion that he did, but there's no doubt at all that on his way out of Kuwait, he blew up the Kuwaiti oil fields, set them ablaze, flooded the Gulf, killed, for those of you who care about these kinds of things, and I know you do, killed huge numbers of seals, birds, that kind of thing. While I'm in Berkeley, I'm not going to waste this opportunity. Generally behaved very bad, but also insanely, megamaniacally, pyromaniacally, and without rationality. Now the question is, do you want to find out what this guy would be like if he ever got the uranium or the plutonium? Do you want to find that out or not? Or would you rather say that we've seen enough and we would rather take the side of his enemies and of his people and see the last of him? I think that's a no-brainer myself. There's another guy advertising his wares from the back of the hall. A cheap peddler crying his wares from there.
We're not going to...
No takers, I understand.
So we're not going to get everybody to come to a consensus, so that's fine. Let's go.
In 1989, Benjamin Netanyahu told a group of... I'm too tall, the microphone's too short. It's fine. In 1989, Benjamin Netanyahu told a group of Israeli college students that Israel should have took advantage of Tiananmen Square massacres to expel Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. In recent polls this summer, over 60% of Israelis supported transferring Palestinians from the occupied territories. With the rightward shift of Israel, with the elections coming up, with the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is a leading Likud candidate, what do you think about the prospects of Israel using the war in Iraq as a cover for ethnic cleansing, as a lot of Palestinians and Israelis right now are afraid of? And has that figured into your calculations and your position on the war in Iraq? Thank you.
the Sharon government has invited, the situation is in some ways worse than you say, in some ways perhaps not as bad. The Sharon government has invited on more than one occasion in its shifting coalitions the supporters or leaders of pro-expulsion parties into the Israeli cabinet. It's well known. People who openly advocate what is disgustingly called transfer. In other words, the forcible deportation of the remaining Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza, either into Jordan, across the river, or into Gaza, into a kind of massive holding pen, pending a further solution. And there are, it's very sad to have to say, quite a number of people in the United States, including quite senior Republican congressmen and spokesmen for the Christian Coalition and others, who have also advocated this. And it seems to me a great responsibility on everybody's part to repudiate this idea of a racist cleansing campaign, whether it was conducted under cover of war or for any other reason. Now the question is, would war make it more likely or less? I personally think it makes it less, but I hope I'm not being optimistic, because the United States government in such a case, it seems to me, would have no choice at all but to forcibly restrain Israel or any crazy general or politician who liked the idea from taking advantage of a war which involves the international interest, the will of the UN, and a whole number of other very important civilizational questions. For Israel to take advantage of such a thing, to pursue a policy that is evidently racist and repulsive, would be unpardonable, and I think would be opposed. But it's something I think there should be a lot more vigilance about than there is, and I think it's very badly reported in our press that there is this constant threat for a cleansing of the occupied territories.
I think we maybe should take one more question from each side, and then Christopher will be out at the table signing books, and you can talk to him individually at that time.
If you're holding a receipt. The pro bono period will be over by then.
Okay, let's go over here.
You said that, no blood for oil is simplistic, and, and of course oil is worth fighting for. I just wonder, how far do you go with that? I mean, is it worth burying people alive in the desert for oil?
I mean, if you seriously ask me specifically, is it worth not just fighting for oil, a war, but fighting a war in which people were killed?
Were buried alive.
Shall we say, or burned alive? Why not burned alive? Why not blown to pieces? Why not?
How many Iraqis are going to die for your regime change?
I don't think it's a very deconstructive rephrasing of my original point. I mean, yes, if it's worth fighting for, I'm willing to accept what's entailed in what I say.
Can you take one more question, sir? Just one more question.
Am I going to enlist? That's a good one.
Can you take one more question, sir? Just one more question.
I hope it has struck people by now that we're talking about a war or series of conflicts in which civilians, American civilians, are quite near the front line. In fact, nearer than many soldiers are. So it seems to me ridiculous to ask of people whether they favor the war or oppose it, what their attitude to enlistment is. You've already been enlisted, sweetie, by being a civilian.
Sir, can I ask you one more question?
Could I have a question here, actually? I'll give you a chance to. But
sure.
Yeah. Okay. I've noticed, Christopher, I've read a lot of what you've written in the past year, and you never talk about the people who may be killed in this war, not the Iraqis or the Americans. And I think when you talk about the Americans who are on the front lines, you are conflating the Iraqi war and the bin Laden forces, which are not one and the same, in fact. And I would just like you to address the question of the numbers of people that may be killed in this war, and is the consequence, and at what point is that consequence outweighed by, the oil? How many people are worth killing in order to protect the oil?
Well, it's very flattering of you to ask me as if I knew the answer to whether more people. It's very flattering. Excuse me. It's distinctly flattering to be asked, so respectfully and politely, I must say, as if I might know whether more people would die whether Saddam Hussein forced us into war now or later. I mean, in other words, that I could tell you in advance what the respective tolls might be, or how many people he might kill if there was no war with him at all. I can't tell you the answer to that either. I would suspect on the past evidence a lot would be the answer. On your point of conflation, I'm not so sure you're right to say that the civilian-soldier dichotomy is as strong as you think. I don't know who put anthrax in my mailroom in Washington last year. Nobody does yet. I know there are people who think it would be witty to make it smallpox instead, and I know that Iraq has been involved in producing and distributing a great deal of this stuff, and I certainly know those are the weapons of choice of the other side. So no, I don't feel that there's any question at all. One reason why people are taking this argument so seriously is because in the age of weapons of mass destruction, wielded, by the way, by either side, the distinction between civilian and soldier is more or less morally abolished, at least as regards safety or the right to criticize. After all, if I was a woman taking this position, and suppose I was 55 and a mother, you wouldn't taunt me for not putting on a uniform and say I had no right to my opinion, would you? So if you don't want to be addressed as a moron, don't talk to people as if they were stupid. Well, sometimes the temptation is a bit much, I have to say.
Yeah, well, after 150 years of history of intervention around the world against
what have we got here?
Like Allende, in Panama, in Yugoslavia, overthrowing government, what do you think guarantees that the United States is going to be fair and impose justice wherever it goes with these armies? And why do you think the United States has the right to intervene all around the world and impose its bases all around the planet and its corporations around the planet and this very honorable intent of bringing democracy around the world? I mean, where do you find those morals in this regime? And then the other thing is, if you are so concerned about the life of the Kurds, are you concerned about the people who were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all other wars that the United States carry around the planet? I mean, are you concerned about that? Are you concerned about the weapon of mass destruction, the arsenal that the United States has?
Could you finish up, please?
These are questions. These are all questions. The last question is, are you still reminiscing of the old decadent British Empire?
I never thought I'd be doing this, but I'm going to have to ask you to repeat the last bit. How perfectly ghastly. Maybe someone can tell me what the British bit was. Am I reminiscent of it? Well, that would be for someone else to say. Am I nostalgic for it? I could say. But I think, as with the rest of the question, I'm going to make an arrogant assumption. I'm going to say that I don't believe anyone will object if I say I've had enough of it. And I have answered all those questions already, and it's time for me to go and sign books. But thank you very much indeed.
Can you take one more? Can you take just one more, sir? I came a long way. Mr. Hitchens, can you take one more?